Thank you very much. It's about the third of this kind of event that I've been to recently. It's that time of year. And I keep hunting for the person who's going to say, this is what this guy is doing wrong. So if anybody's harboring anything like that, I would like to hear it. I can't tell you how, after almost 40 years at Newsweek magazine, it pained me to see those images of Time magazine and his Man of the Year. I keep thinking what I could have done with that material. And then I hear Matt Malone talk about these secular journalists asking him all these ridiculous questions. And I'm thinking, oh my God, is that the reputation we had all these years? I want to begin with an image. When John Paul II, 1978, came out and for the first time, he said something that astounded evangelist Billy Graham. Billy told me this story. The first thing he said practically was, the Pope, Christ is the answer. And Billy calls me up, he says, oh my God, this guy's an evangelist. He was talking his language. We've heard a lot of talk today about this Pope being an evangelist. One of the things that crosses my mind, well, we've had one of these before, and we still had problems. There's still a large part of the world that isn't evangelized, and I still don't have the damnedest idea what the new evangelism is to this point. But there is this difference, and this is by way of question, or any one of you that might want to comment on this. It seems to me that since the election of John Paul II, and I include Benedict as well, that however they were trying to be evangelistic, that we were in a period of boundary maintenance in the Catholic Church, and that's the phrase I like to use, which there was a lot of confusion in the 70s, and we don't need to revisit that. It seems to me that John Paul II, whatever else he did, thought he would establish a Catholic identity, which is what boundaries are partly about. He would do it through catechism, which was one of the achievements. That's what catechisms do, I guess. Also his embrace of certain lay Catholic movements and not so lay, Opus Dei, things like that. But the point was to remind Catholics of who they are and to draw boundaries or distinctions so that they knew who they weren't. Well, it seemed, okay, now we have a Pope who talked about, right away, about boundaries and going out to the boundaries. Yes, when we've heard all this talk today, and just from John Allen, about this image of the hospital, the field hospital, and we hear a lot of talk about mission, being a missionary church, and so forth. Well, to my ears, that is what missionaries, Catholic missionaries, typically do, which is to go out to some place on the boundary and establish a school, a hospital, or something like that, and the people in India or Pakistan see these people doing things and providing something they can use, and only later are they invited to look into the faith, and sometimes, you know, not at all. That's the image I have when I hear this idea of field hospital. But here's my question to any one of you, and it's this, but I think not all of you, because that would take up too much time. It seems to me that the boundary maintenance still needs to be done. This week, if you were in South Bend, you would hear, you could have gone to Christian Smith, the sociologist's introduction of a book on Catholic youth in the United States. It's not a pretty picture, it's a terrible picture. And so the idea or the challenge to give them a strong Catholic identity is still there, obviously hasn't been met. We're not forming them in the faith. I'm wondering if all the excitement about this current Pope can make up in any way for lack of success in Catholic formation? Will charisma alone do it? Do I want to answer my own question? Well, this seems to be a hidden dimension of a dimension that has not been addressed with respect to this Pope. And I bet I can go down these rows and find a lot of parents and grandparents whose kids are either not in a church or the prospects are very dim. And that seems to me, then, I'll answer my own question, one of the great unaddressed questions here, which brings me to, excuse me, Father Morello. I was wondering, from the Argentine point of view, is there something, as you read the American papers, that we are missing? What must I know about this Pope as an Argentine and coming out of the Argentine experience? What one thing ought North Americans to know that they probably don't?
I think that the experience of populism is the most important thing that makes a distinction, in the sense that we don't have this kind of pejorative sense on the idea of populism. So the respect for the people that is implied there is very important. We don't have a tradition of human rights through civil rights, but on the social rights. So our historical tradition, our historical facts is that we got human rights through workers' rights. So the whole idea of social Catholicism is much more, I guess, South American or Latin America or Argentina in that sense, but maybe here. So I guess that's a point. Because of being from Latin America and from the end of the world, as he said, we have some lack, some shortage of what's going on in Africa and Asia, for example, and the Pope will have to learn about that. So I guess that there's a kind of lagoon there, things that should be fulfilled. But I guess that the main idea is this respect for the people, this idea that the people's religiosity has some value there, that the Pope is not an elitist. I think that the problem with the liturgy is not that he's a progressive guy, but he's not elitist. So any kind of thing that put the distance between the people and the priest of the church will be rejected by the Pope.
Let me ask one follow-up question of you on this. There's a book out, and I can't think of the man's name. He's Argentine. He wrote a book on the Pope. There was a great rush to write about Pope. And they feel that at a certain point, after he was Jesuit superior at a very young age, and comes away feeling that he was disappointing in some sense in that role, that he went out to another city and he went through a deep spiritual transformation. Is that story widely understood or accepted, or is it even true? And he came back a different person.
Yeah, the point was that he was the rector of students in 1986 in Argentina, then, and that happened in Buenos Aires, in Buenos Aires city, and then the superiors moved him to Córdoba, which is my city. Mm-hmm. So he stayed there for 3 or 4 years and then came back as Bishop of Buenos Aires. It was a regular appointment as a Jesuit. There were some turmoil there that some of them saw it as a punishment. I don't want to think my city as a punishment place. I don't buy that. And it's a kind of important city, at least from Argentina. But he went there, he stayed there, and then he became bishop. I don't know anything about the spiritual conversion there, but I mean the main conversion that he went as Jesuit and came back a bishop. So that's kind of conversion.
Well, that's a spiritual transformation. I would ask John Allen or Peter Bernardi, who's been going to Rome regularly. Either one of you. We hear stories, and John Allen touched on this on the end, of resentful people in the Curia. And I think your point is very well taken. There were lots of people who've given their lives to that place, and the Pope's language could be interpreted as hurtful language. But how much resistance is there to this? If anybody is critical of the Pope, a bishop especially, it makes the news. But I have a feeling there's not a lot of them, and that it's not a very smart thing to do in the first place. But what do you sense, because you're there a lot?
Well, certainly there is resistance, but I don't think it's principally ideological resistance, in the sense that conservatives are mobilizing against a perceived liberal pope or something like that. I think it more has to do with the fact that there are some deeply entrenched ways of doing business in the Vatican that are perceived to be in danger under Francis. I mean, the most concrete recent example would be Pope Francis just created this new finance structure for the Vatican. It's a three-part thing where there is a council of overseers. He abolished a council of 15 cardinals. He used to be in charge of the Vatican's money operation. And in place of it, created a council made up of 8 cardinals and 7 laity. The first time, by the way, that laity in the Vatican have ever sat on a decision-making council is fully equals with cardinals. Then there's a Secretariat of the Economy, which is in charge of overseeing basically, financial accountability and transparency. To run this outfit, by the way, Francis named a tough-as-nails Australian cardinal by the name of George Pell. Central thing to know about George Pell is that when he was a teenager, people thought that he was going to go pro in Australian rules football. I don't know if you've ever seen an Australian rules football game, but it's like NFL-style hits without the pads. Okay, so it's a rare game when there aren't a couple guys carried off on a stretcher, and George was usually the guy putting them onto the stretcher. I mean, if I can use this image in Chicago, this guy is basically Brian Urlacher in a cassock. Okay, is where he's coming. So Francis means business is the point by this appointment, and then he also created an independent auditor. I will tell you that there is no way to threaten the grip of the old guard in the Vatican more directly than to take away their power in the purse, and that is basically what Francis has done. And Ken, to your point, is there resistance to that? Well, of course there is, because this isn't just policy change, this is cultural change. I mean, the problem with money in the Vatican isn't so much like the occasional episodes of overt scandal. I mean, there certainly have been those. But those are relatively easy to identify and fix. The problem is there are all kinds of patterns of behavior that we all would think of as shady that aren't even perceived as corrupt there. I mean, so for example, you've got a competitive bidding procedure, but in the end, you steer the contract to your cousin. I mean, that's just what's done. Or a Monsignor shows up with a briefcase full of cash that he wants to deposit in his account at the Vatican Bank. You don't ask him where the money came from because he's della familia, he's a member of the family, and so it's that culture that has to be broken. Certainly there would be resistance to that. But let me just say this: at the most senior levels of the church, because the version of the question, Ken, that you just asked that I normally get. Is those 114 cardinals who elected Jorge Mario Bergoglio, how are they feeling today, right? Is there any buyer's remorse, in that group? And having spoken to about a third of those guys, let me tell you, there certainly would be some cardinals who would be alarmed around the edges, okay, at some of what they would see as the kind of loosey-goosey, or, to use your language, things that sort of fudge Catholic identity. I mean, there would be some of that concern. However, I know very, very few of these guys who would actually want to roll the clock back to March 12th, 2013. And, that's both for the lofty reason that they see everything that's happened as the working of the Spirit in the life of the church, but it's also for a much more prosaic reason, which is that having a wildly popular pope simply makes their lives much easier. Okay, what these guys will tell you when they're being honest is that if they need a favor from a legislature these days, it is much easier to get because no politician in the world wants to be on the wrong side of this pope. When they go on TV, the questions are no longer about pedophile priests or crackdowns on nuns. They're about rock star pope takes the world by storm. Okay, when they go into parishes, people aren't angry anymore, they're euphoric. Okay, and on and on and on. I mean, it's just utterly transformed their daily experience.
Can I say something to the effect?
By all means, go ahead.
Culture of change. One of the things too, and of course it was the during like almost 4 years in Rome that I've seen clearly that it's different in terms of the cultural shift, is a number of cardinals that are taking much more the risk of engaging publicly and disagreeing with other cardinals. So the instance of that was Cardinal Rodriguez, for instance, and Mueller. I mean, I know that I've always stated, and John Allen knows this because we've had conversations, and you know, that the Vatican is not a monolithic institution, and there are differences. Neither is the U.S. Catholic Bishops' Conference. But I think what has happened, though, in the past is that people have been reluctant to express difference publicly for a number of reasons, and I think that is changing. I think you've seen a number of high-ranking members of the Roman Curia disagree. You know, whether it's Casper with so and so or exactly. And so I think that this is very interesting because that was there, but it was done privately, or those things came to a number of us on a private level, but never on a public level. And now you're seeing that much more on a public level, and I think that's a culture change.
You want to say something? Yeah.
Two brief remarks. A facetious remark: among the forces of opposition, John, the Roman tailors of ecclesiastical garb, are they part of the resistance?
Yeah, Gamma is in a slump.
Serious remark. There's been rumors that the mafia has a contract on the Pope's life. I don't know whether, I've heard that from more than one person.
Probably the same people who are telling you he's going out at night to give sandwiches to the guys around St. Peter's
Well,
Square, right?
he recently he spoke at an anti-mafia annual liturgy, and on that occasion, he is the Pope of Mercy, but he actually invoked hell. He said, if you continue to do what you're doing, killing people with impunity, etc., you are risking hell. So he can talk very directly.
Oh, yeah.
It's not just fuzzy mercy. But you mentioned Pell and the redoing these committees that are going to look after the Vatican finances and that is touching. I mean, the finances seem to be a mess. The Vatican Bank, that's not what's its official name?
The Institute of the Wars.
Right. So, is there, when you cataloged a number of groups that might be opposed to this Pope, what's your thought on that? The opposition coming from mafia and others tied into a corrupt financial system.
Well, I mean, nobody spoke more harshly about the grip of the mafia in Italian life than John Paul II. And of course, it was also John Paul II who decided to beatify the famous anti-mafia priest of Brancaccio in Sicily, Don Pino Pugliese. Listen, I mean, I think, you always got to be worried about all that. But, this thing about, the mafia taking out a contract on Francis's life, I mean, the truth of it is, in terms of what the real threats to the physical safety of the Pope are, listen, I've covered presidents, I've covered prime ministers, and I've also covered popes. And I will tell you this, the security membrane around the Pope is significantly thinner than it is around any other world leader you were ever encountered. I mean, look at how Obama, whooshed into St. Peter's Square today with all these armor-plated SUVs behind him. I mean, the Pope does not do that, when he travels. And let's also remember, the most serious threat against any Pope's life in the last 40 years, one was the assassination attempt against Paul VI when he was in Manila, and the other was Mehmet Ali Yanka against John Paul II in 1981. May 13th, by the way, the Feast of Our Lady of Fatima. And neither of these had any kind of organized, faction that had some issue with the Pope behind them. These were basically lone nutballs who took advantage of the fact that the Pope is remarkably exposed. And this is to some extent self-conscious. I mean, popes don't want to put themselves needlessly at risk, but they also understand themselves to be pastors who want to try to remain close to ordinary people as much as that is possible. In their position. And so you were constantly going, I think the bottom line is, you were constantly going to live with the fact that popes are perpetually at risk, whether they are in Rome or at the road, to a degree that no other world figure is. And to some extent, it is remarkable, I think, that there haven't been more attempts on popes that we've seen. So, look, I mean, is the mafia a real and present danger? Sure. But you know, if you could somehow get the mafia to drop off the face of the earth tomorrow, could we rest easy about the Pope's physical safety? No. And one other final point about Vatican money. One of my standard rants with my colleagues is that I have no problem reporting on the financial scandals and the financial difficulties of the Vatican because they are legion and they are well documented and they need to be cleaned up, and thank God that Francis seems to be getting serious about it. But one thing is, can we actually put in the dollar amounts we're talking about when we talk about the Vatican's financial situation? Because the truth of it is that by the standards that all of us are accustomed to, the Vatican actually is small potatoes financially. I mean, do you know what the annual operating budget of the Vatican is? US dollars is about $360 million. That's what it costs to, you know, turn on the lights and pay people's salaries and so on. Now, do you know what the annual operating budget at the University of Notre Dame is? It's $1.4 billion, which means that Notre Dame could fund the Vatican 3.5 times every year and have money left over for new football uniforms. Or, you know, the cash holdings of the Vatican Bank. The Vatican Bank, all in, all 19,000 accounts, okay, you're talking about deposits worth roughly $9 billion. Now, I don't want to tell you that's chump change, but this certainly is not Chase Manhattan, you know, that kind of scale. I mean, again, the endowment of Notre Dame is more than that. The endowment of Harvard is more than that. And by the way, of that $9 billion, most of it doesn't belong to the Vatican. Most of it is deposits that belong to dioceses and religious orders and Catholic movements around the world. So, I mean, listen, the mafia, if it wanted to target some institution in terms of how much financial exposure it actually has, it would have a lot of places it would target, I think, before it rolled around to the Vatican.
I'm going to call Father Jenkins at Notre Dame and tell him to watch out for the mafia coming in. Susan Ross, I wanted to ask you, and you're going to have to help me with this question. I'm wondering what, if you've gotten to the point of a concrete idea as what the church could do under this Pope to answer some of your concerns, apart from changing their language, mind you. I'm thinking particularly, and here's where I need your help. There was a wonderful Catholic woman who was an anthropologist at Northwestern University for many years, and I'm hoping you can remember her name. And she made a suggestion. She wrote about Purity and Danger was one of her books.
Mary Douglas.
Mary Douglas, yes. Mary Douglas wrote an essay one time in which she suggested, on the assumption that there would be no ordained women, that the church create a body of women, representative from around the world, through which would pass, before it became effective, any legislation that might affect women, and pretty much everything any legislation would affect women, it seems to me. Is that a practical idea, or is there anything like that that you could come up with that would alleviate what you're talking about?
Well, I think one positive sign was the questionnaire that was sent out to the bishops, and that the sort of rolling out of that questionnaire was not handled very well in the U.S. I think it was handled much better in some European countries. And so that does give me hope in the sense that there's an indication that he's interested in what people think. And so secondly, the appointment of women to the Commission on Child Abuse. And so that's a very positive movement right there. You know, and I hate to sort of say, well, just have women be there at the Synod on the Family. I mean, my point, of course, in my speaking was that to say that that's all women are concerned about is to just keep stereotyping. But that would be a start, to have women in positions during the Synod on the Family who would actually be able to speak up, to be on commissions that would be formed after that would then be taken up the following year by what the bishops are planning to do. Now, you know, I appreciated what Miguel had to say about bishops disagreeing with each other, because, you know, there are many parishes, there are some dioceses where there are women chancellors, there are women who actually have fairly significant roles. But the problem is that in many ways tends to be very limited in the sense that women's own voices are being heard is still a problem. And another thing that I would like to see is the whole issue of the LCWRs being basically put under receivership. I would like to see that dropped, and I would like to see some more action taken on the bishops who have been involved in basically cover-ups. I mean, someone like Finn in Kansas City, I mean, it's a scandal that that person is still, you know, in office. So I think there are some small steps being taken that I think are very positive. I mean, simply asking for people's ideas. You know, I think I mentioned I'll be in Rome in about 10 days, and if I can get a copy of Beth Johnson's book in Spanish, I'll bring it with me and see if I can pass it on. So, you know, I'm not totally pessimistic, as I said, cautiously non-pessimistic. And I think, too, that the whole issue of the diaconate, that's getting some more traction, I think. And so there are some places where I have some hope.
Well, when you think that the Jesuits were in receivership for a while, and they came out all right afterwards, did they not? Father Malone, I don't think of this question. Apart from the fact is, what other Jesuits are people material? You must know a few more now that they've had one. No, that's not my question. You talked about the media and so forth. From what I read in the paper, and now that I live in Chicago, I read the Tribune as well as the New York Times, I wouldn't get a very good sense from what I'm reading in the media. Secular media is what I mean, and in a certain sense all media are secular. It just depends who's publishing it and at what point of view. But I don't get a sense that the filtration system that operates, the kind of questions that came to you, they still don't understand the Pope. And most people, I hate to say it, don't read Commonweal or America or First Things or all these other publications. And the Pope that they're going to get is the Pope mediated through the secular press. How can you handle that? I mean, already we hear that, for example, he said, "Who am I to judge?" And it was misunderstood in the context. But also when he talked about sin, opening Lent, I haven't heard in the secular press anything about sin because they don't associate sin with this man. They associate mercy, which without sin, of course, doesn't mean anything. But how does one get around the problem? Or do you become editor of the New York Times? So that there's something. How do you get around the problem of what's being fed to people and how unreal it is?
Well, first of all, I think we have to be realistic about what we're asking the secular press to do, and you know, and understand how they report on stories, and you know, frequently they're in the business of crafting narratives around events, and that frequently requires has a kind of binary structure, and that's often an incomplete or inadequate way of telling the story of the church. But I don't think that we should blame the secular press for that. I think we really should look at our own house first. The two things strike me there. One is we cannot very well criticize the secular press for getting the story about the church wrong if the Catholic press is not doing such a great job of it either, right? And I think that frequently the reporting on the church in the Catholic press is not different enough from the reporting that we see in the secular press, which is not to say that it's bad throughout in both, but I think it should be qualitatively different, and that difference frequently, in my own judgment, is not as well pronounced as it should be. But secondly, you know, I think we have got to, people in positions of authority or people in positions to communicate with the mass media need to get over this notion that the press is the enemy of the church, right? Because they're not. I mean, most people who work in the media are interested in getting the story right, and they're trying, right? And I think we need to see it, particularly those of us who work in the Catholic press, as our obligation to help them do it, to help them to tell the story, to help them to get it right. Because at a very practical level, they're going to tell our story, whether we help them or not. So why not help them to tell it? And in my own experience, I'm sure this is probably the case with John as well, people welcome this kind of collaboration, and for the most part. So I think those two things we should really look at in-house before we do anything else. One is, how are we as how is the Catholic press itself reporting on the church? I think there are some really important questions and issues there. And secondly, how can we really build bridges to the secular press?
I got a few minutes for a question from the audience, if someone would like to do that. Yes, well, there's two right there. Let's take those two.
Thanks so much. My question is directed to the entire panel, but in particular the Latino speakers. As many are aware, during the 70s, there was a very strong liberation theology movement in Central America. And some critics of the current Pope say that during this era, there was happening a lot of systematic violence against Jesuits who professed liberation theology kind of ideology. So there was a lot of violence against these types of Jesuits, and some critics say that Pope Francis, the reason why there were protests when he visited Argentina was because many there were saying that he didn't do enough or he didn't speak out enough in opposition to that. So my question is, people like Oscar Romero and other leading Jesuits who were murdered in this period, my question is it true that Pope Francis was not very vocal in opposition to this in the 70s? And if so, how does this reflect on the Pope and the Church in terms of leadership and mercy? Thank you.
There were two Jesuits who disappeared in 1976. Two of them, Father Francisco Jalix and Orlando Llorio, they were working in an slumville in Bajo Flores. A month before they disappeared, 14 lay persons who were working there in the slumville disappeared, among them Monica Mignone, the daughter of a very well-known Catholic activist in the Argentine church. After that, we have two versions. So this one led by Mignone, whose source is Orlando Llorio, who died in 2003, I think. He says in his book, Church and Dictatorship, one of the first memoirs in Argentinian 70s, he says that Bergoglio, as a provincial, didn't cover these people enough. Like he expelled them from the society, and that was a kind of permission for the security forces to kidnap those persons. The other version is Bergoglio's, one that appeared in an interview in 2007 in a book called The Jesuit in Argentina. Now the book has been issued, an interview to Pope Francis or something like that. He says that, well, I told them, I actually expelled them from the society because I told them they had to leave that place. Okay, they were exposing themselves, they were going to be kidnapped as the other people, so I told them, you have to leave. They say no, and Bergoglio said, well, I told them, you are not paying obedience to your provincial, you have to leave the Jesuit order. In that period, they were kidnapped. Jalix and Llorio said that while they were in prison, they felt that Bergoglio was there. They couldn't see him, but they felt that. And because my experience with the research I did, I think that people have a kind of special feelings or a kind of special attention to that. And Bergoglio said, yes, I was there. I went there to visit them because I want to assure that they were alive. So I mocked the whole thing. I called the Navy chaplain that he said that he was ill, so I would have to cover him. So I went to the Navy prison and I visited them. I couldn't talk to them, but I was there and I visited them. And the whole point, Bergoglio said, well, and at the end, I got them free, which is true. I mean, those people survive, you know, and it's not true in most of the cases among disappeared people in Argentina. They killed 2 bishops, 5 Palotinian priests. So there is this whole thing about Bergoglio. He wasn't a liberation theologist priest for sure. Okay, he was not encouraging that point of view. But if you are, first, the provincial of the Jesuits in 1876 in Argentina and now is not an important figure. I mean, who is the provincial of the Jesuits today?
Right.
I mean, do you know who is he? I have to know him, and don't tell him that I'm saying that, but who is him? I mean, Bergoglio was not the Pope, was the provincial Jesuit, 140 Jesuits in the whole country, that's it. Okay, so he wasn't this kind of big church man, okay? And he said, well, I have to protect my people. So I told them, leave those places that are at risk, go back to the traditional place, and those people didn't want to do that. So I expelled them because this is what I have to do as provincial. For that reason, I mentioned that he's part of this level that said that institutional church. There was one, they tried to keep relations with the state, and in order to be able to go to the Navy base to ask for the release of that people, but they didn't make a public statement like most of the people in the church in Argentina. And not just the church, I mean, it's another discussion, another topic, but in Argentina in 76, not many people did anything. I mean, if you look at political parties, unions, main press, 0.5% of the city hall, the mayor of the city halls in Argentina were people with some affiliation to political parties. The founder of the Argentinian Socialist Party was Fidel ambassador in Portugal. So, I mean, with the newspaper, with the Monday's newspaper, we know how to put the team on the field on Sunday, you know, but you have to do that on Saturday, not on the next Monday.
Miguel, did you want to get?
No, I mean, I don't want to add anything. I mean, that's the only thing I would have added is just that I was talking to one of my colleagues in the academy just recently at Emory a couple of weeks ago, and we just kind of looked at each other and we said, who would have thought that Gustavo Gutierrez,
Well, that's the point I was just going to
who would have been welcomed at the Vatican, the founder of Latin American Liberation Theology, and has gotten so much attention in the last few weeks. I mean, none of us would have thought that that would have happened.
If you don't know what Ambassador Diaz is talking about, I was actually at that event, which was like 3 weeks ago. So, I mean, he just gave you the answer about Bergoglio in the 1970s. Let's talk about Pope Francis today. I think the clear impression among people who are involved still in the various forms of liberation theology would be that this Pope is a friend. In the most recent symbolic expression of that would be in Rome about 3 weeks ago. There was an event in which the prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, who is currently Cardinal Gerhard Müller, hosted a public symposium in the evening in a Vatican audience hall. It was actually the headquarters of the Pontifical Council for Social Communications, in which the Peruvian theologian who was known as the founder of liberation theology, Father Gustavo Gutierrez, whose 1971 book actually gave the name to the movement, okay, the theology of liberation, who was on the outs for a while with some of the bishops in Peru and so on, and who was under investigation for a period of time. But who was actually a friend of Cardinal Müller, because Cardinal Müller got to know Gutierrez, spends some time every summer in Peru with him, working with the poor and so on. So Gutierrez was there, Müller was there, and Cardinal Oscar Rodriguez Maradiaga of Honduras, who was the coordinator of the Pope's G8 Council of Cardinal Advisors, and is also seen in Latin America as a friend of liberation theology. Those three guys were on stage together. And just to make, and first of all, if you know anything at all about the history of this debate, okay, the relationship between liberation theologians and German-speaking Vatican doctrinal czars, okay, I mean, the iconography of that evening was just unbelievable, but then add to the fact that Müller put on a Latin American poncho and they had a mariachi band. I mean, it was, you almost felt like you were witnessing the end of history, like, you know, what
a German dancing?
You know?
A German dancing? That is the end of history.
Yeah. Anyway, the point is, I think that whatever the controversies of the past may be, I think there is a clear impression today that on Francis's watch, okay, if what we mean by liberation theology is a genuine option for the poor, okay, then the answer is a definitive yes.
One more question. The person in the blue shirt, thank you.
Mr. Allen, in talking about the pastoral orientation of the present Pope, indicated that that would trickle on down to people who were appointed by him to positions of bishoprics throughout the world. And of course you are in Chicago. And we have a situation here where there has been a resignation letter that has been tendered, and whenever that might be filled, I'm just interested about what attributes of the person who may be a person who smells like the sheep we might expect in terms of the personality of Chicago. Are there any particular attributes, either generally in filling a bishopric, or specifically in filling any vacancy that may occur in the future in Chicago, what one might expect in terms of appointment from this type of pope?
Look, I mean, if what's behind that question is, do I know who the new Archbishop of Chicago is? The answer to that is no. But let me just make a couple observations. One, I think this is probably likely to be the first appointment in the United States in which Pope Francis is personally engaged. Up to this point, I did the count a month ago, and at that stage there had been 17 bishops' appointments in the United States, since Francis's election. But all of those were kind of business as usual appointments that have not really reached the level of the Pope's desk. Chicago certainly will. Okay, so in that sense, Chicago therefore looms as the kind of bellwether test case, in terms of what kind of tone Francis wants to set for the episcopacy in the United States. Secondly, you asked about kind of the profile. Well, I mean, I think if you look at, I think the key would be to look at his appointments in the Holy See, because that really is the environment where Francis has started. Okay, I think in his mind, he's thinking in terms of concentric circles when it comes to personnel. First, he wants to get his team in place in the Holy See, and then secondly, he'll start worrying about getting his team in place in important archdioceses around the world as they become available. So, look at the important appointments he's made in the Vatican, and I think the big picture is clear. I mean, the big picture is that to some extent in the John Paul years, certainly in the Benedict years, the preferred categories from which the pools in which you went fishing for your new bishops tended to be theologians and canon lawyers. Okay, those were the guys who were typically on the fast track. If you look at Francis's key appointments, the pools in which he goes fishing are pastors, frontline pastors, and Vatican diplomats. People who have been in nunciaturas around the world. And I think in both cases it's because his perception is these are people who have lived most of their lives outside of the church. And that is, they're in contact. If you want to get out of if you want the church to get out of the sacristy and in the street, then you want somebody whose life experience leads you to believe they have that kind of capacity to engage not just the inside Catholic crowd, but the kind of wider world in conversation. I think it is less important to Francis whether they profile as left, right, or center. I mean, if you look at the people he's appointed, George Pell would be seen, the guy who's in charge of this new finance ministry, would be seen by most Catholic observers as, kind of a flame-throwing arch-conservative. I mean, that would be his profile in Australia. But on the other hand, Pietro Parolin, who's his new Secretary of State, would be seen very much as a moderate. As I said, Oscar Rodriguez, who's the coordinator of his G8 Council, he's not living in the Vatican, but it's sort of a quasi-Vatican position, would be seen as left of center. So I don't think there's an ideological litmus test. I think the litmus test is pastoral and personal. What he wants to know is this somebody who whose life experience leads you to believe they understand the experiences of ordinary people and can connect with those experiences in a way that makes the gospel real to them. Okay? So, I mean, in broad strokes, that's the kind of person he's going to be looking for in Chicago. Now,
Thank you very much.
If you want, when we're sitting down over a glass of wine or something, I can give you some names. But,
Thank you very much. Thank you all on the panel.